Hello aliens. This episode is focused on creating the correct mindset you will require if you want to survive long term in a relatively competitive multiplayer game. So let's start by evaluating the stages of a Stellaris game and what they generally look like. Firstly, we have the early game. This stage of the game lasts roughly 25 years and can dictate much of the later game. Survival is critical in this early game. There are many aggressive builds out there in multiplayer, and lately I have seen a huge increase in the numbers of Purification Empires. You do not have to play a Purification Empire to survive, however, you must be ready for war. Players who refuse to build up a standing army will find themselves quickly attacked by aggressive players in their quest for growth. Don't just expand for the sake of expanding. I see some people build lines of star bases taking claims to a mass number of systems just because they can. What in turn this means is they waste a lot of minerals in building their territory up, minerals that would have better been spent elsewhere. When you expand, consider the cost of expansion, how quick you will see the returns, and if that money could or should be better spent in a fleet. Colonies are comparatively expensive. Colonize when it's economically sensible to do so. If you need to build a few star bases with little gains in each system just to colonize a large world, it probably isn't worth it just yet. Those minerals spent potentially puts you massively behind that neighbor of yours, and he will be looking at your new tasty colony that you will now struggle to defend. Stealing colonies and homeworlds in the early game is the best way to expand. Colonizing and growing pops is slow, and you can just invest in a fleet and have other players effectively colonize for you. Mobile fleets are superior to stations. Stations can easily be avoided. In the early game you do not have any restrictive starport tech to really make choke points work, and the enemy can take ownership of your high resource production systems if you have no fleet, thus decreasing your income while increasing his. You don't have to go to war in the early game to be successful. Often an aggressive rusher wants an easy target, and if you look ready for him, chances are he will look elsewhere for an easier target to attack, or be too scared to rush someone else because he's too worried about you coming into the rear of him as he's moved his fleet away. The mid-game is from around year 2225 to the year 2300. You will have more flexibility at this stage of the game, as you should be more established and have an idea of what is near you. At this point, any successes made in the early game will start to show. If you were aggressive and got some planets with high value systems from your neighbours, your economy will really start to go ahead, allowing you to build more ships or start to invest elsewhere. Sacrificed opportunities from the early game can be made up for in the mid game. This means that you now have a stable economy. You can start to work on building those research stations on systems you ignored earlier. You can also start to colonize those systems that were much more expensive in the early game to get. Do not get slack with fleet, and ensure you are always looking at other players and what they are up to. Consider how their early game went. This will give you an idea of their position, their playstyle, and their mindset. Adjust your game plan appropriately to these factors. The mid-game is also quite aggressive. Keep looking at your opponents, because someone who was inferior 10 years ago can quite quickly become superior if they start turning their economy into a mass fleet. In the late game, there are generally clear obvious superpowers that are formed, and they're lining up for the final battle to knock each other out. How many pops a player has in the endgame will make a large difference in the outcome of the game. Science gains made in the early and mid game will make the most difference in the late stages of the game. Tool empires can start to catch up with those that expanded aggressively in the early and mid game, and weapon techs potentially able to truly hard counter other players' builds in the late game make tech all that more important. Geographically, large empires can lose their edge in the late game if they are far enough behind in technology. You should be looking at investing ways to move quicker across the map. This could be done by having your fleet move quicker at sublight. You could invest in wormhole technology and developing gateways and claiming gateways from your neighbours. On top of travel, you will want to consider choke points. You will want to pick specific systems in which you're going to fortify up to stop small empires from harassing you when you are at war. The late game will also potentially see a crisis appearing, depending on the settings. This can be a real game changer and swing the balance of power by creating opportunity for those weaker empires to hit the superpower while he is busy. There is no harm in allying with a crisis if it means you can swing the game into your favour. If you are not a superpower in the late game, don't just wait for him to eventually eat you. Work together with the galaxy and commit to it. The number of times I have killed groups because a couple of them hesitated to attack me as a coordinated team is numerous. War deck together, not after your mate has just lost his fleet. So now we have an idea of how a Stellaris game will play out. Let's have a look at some other concepts that may help us gain an advantage. Here you can see a modified version of the Prisoner's Dilemma game. What this table shows is that if you and an opponent were to either prepare for peace or war, you can see who would have the advantage of any. From this you can quickly work out that preparing for war is the only logical play, as if you were to prepare for peace it either leaves you equal or behind, where if you were to prepare for war it puts you either equal or ahead of your opponent. For a competitive Stellaris game where you are constantly at risk of being attacked, you must be ready. Now we can see a breakdown of various resources in the game that you would expect to use through the early stage. From this we can see that science is limited in usefulness in the early game. There are two core reasons for this. Firstly, having workers on science tiles or building science stations in space is an opportunity cost. What this means is you probably in the early game are sacrificing minerals for science. This is then compounded with the second major factor, being that a lot of scientific upgrades cost even more minerals to utilise. For example, ship upgrades increase fleet costs, and mining station upgrades on a planet can potentially take a few years to generate a positive return while leaving you with less minerals in the bank to deal with those aggressive neighbours. Unity can give great bonuses in the early game. Things such as reduced fleet costs, increased firepower will really give you the edge when making plays on your expansionist neighbour or defending against that hostile player. Either way, as we've already discussed, preparing for war is the safest way to play, and early Unity used correctly can make big differences in your early game. In the early game, energy is used for transferring pops between planets, buying leaders, and upkeep. Stockpiling large volumes of power is not efficient in the early game, and ideally you want to just be in the positive at all times. If you get good at managing your power, you will just be ticking positive. You will find you have spare pops to bring in other resources that could give you that early game advantage. Minerals are used for everything. You need it to expand, build stations, build ships, even pops depending on your empire. Minerals are the bread and butter of your empire, and an empire without minerals is basically free pops for your neighbours in a Stellaris game. So let's have a look at some conclusions we can make after having looked at the various points before. Survival is your priority. Be ready for war. Minerals are critical, especially in the early game. Unity buffs are huge for early war. In the mid game you can then start to specialise. And we're going to use these points in our next chapter, Designing an Empire.